Chip Chapman is a retired British Army Major General. Welcome to our program, General Chip.
Good afternoon, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would like to begin with the recent statements from US President Donald Trump. Trump threatens Vladimir Putin with tougher measures, with the war getting worse if Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on a ceasefire in Ukraine. Do you feel that the tide is turning against Vladimir Putin right now with the Donald Trumps in the White House?
Well, one thing about Donald Trump is he's a sort of muscular transactionalist. And one of the difficulties at the moment, possibly with that approach, is exactly what we've seen in his approach to Greenland and possibly Canada and Panama, in that someone like Vladimir Putin could see this as an equivalence that, hey, if it's okay for you to make these threats and take things, why can't I? So, sort of policy by Twitter or by stream of consciousness is not the really real way to make policy. So I think we need to just go back to his first mentions, really, of Ukraine when he was campaigning again, really, for the second time. And that would take us back to May 23 and his notion that in terms of the war, he didn't think in terms of winning or losing. He thought in terms of stopping the killing. Now, we might term that a humanitarian peace, i.e. stop the war. And he said that again when he was in Notre Dame on the 7th of December last year. But of course, the problem with that is a ceasefire without any negotiations, or a ceasefire without Russia withdrawing to the 1991 boundaries, is it rewards the aggressor. So that's our left of arc, that he might think of a humanitarian peace, stopping the killing. And that by itself is a good thing, the basic human security need for life. The sort of middle part, I think, of the spectrum we're looking at is General Keith Kellogg's appointment as the envoy, when he, in the run-up to the Trump coming to power, sort of said that he would say something like to Zelensky, come to the table or we'll give you no support, but to Putin, come to the table or we'll give Ukraine all the support they need. And that's partly what we're talking about at the moment. Now, the problem with that at the moment is we don't really know what's on the table. What we do know from Kellogg is the one day I'm going to end the war from Putin is past, and Kellogg is certainly now looking at something like a 100 days time frame. I think that's wildly optimistic itself. But the ththings that they were looking at in terms of Kellogg as part of Trump's transition team were things like a 800-mile demilitarized zone and enforcing presence of whatever size force you want. 5 brigades of 40,000 was a discussion between Macron and the Poles, 100,000's being mentioned. I don't see how any of that is going to be acceptable to Putin, should there be any negotiations, when actually in that respect you achieve something which he's always tried to avoid, which is NATO troops on your border. And the third part of what Kellogg has said was that there should be security guarantees. I think whatever happens, that is vital for Ukraine, because one of the other notions which has been used very recently, both by the National Security Advisor, Waltz, and by Kellogg, is the notion of a sustainable peace. And that is going to be the key thing for Ukraine, not just a just peace, but also a sustainable peace. Now, the right of arc on the support which might come from Ukraine is really, for me, what came out of the Helsinki Commission in September. That is the commission in America under Joe Wilson, who's a South Carolina Republican, which looks at American-Russian relations, which sort of said, when Donald Trump understands the nature of Putin and that he is never going to negotiate in an honest sense, then he will really know the nature of the man and regime, and is likely to go to that right of the arc of Kellogg's thing, that he might support Ukraine with everything that they have. And, the leverage which Trump has is pretty significant in terms of both the volume of aid, either military, humanitarian or fiscal, his notion of ameliorating the oil prices, to also exacerbate the situation with the deep battle strikes on the oil and gas infrastructure, which Ukraine are doing very successfully at the moment. And the last part of that triumvirate would be the tightening the sanctions and possibly using the $300 billion of frozen assets. So all that looks pretty optimistic in the support for Ukraine. I think we have to be, the one point of realism I'd put in here, that Peskov also recently said that the price of oil is irrelevant to the continuation of the war. And I think we always have to bear that in mind, because ultimately authoritarian leaders who have variables themselves, because Putin could get further support from Iran, North Korea or China, ultimately fight wars for political objectives. They've not really achieved any of those political objectives. And one of the reasons I think that Putin has said that he'd want a one-on-one with Trump, and therefore to exclude the agency of President Zelensky and the West, European NATO, the Bucharest Nine, however you want to frame it, is because he sees potentially that if he could play to the narcissism and ego of Trump, then he might be able to achieve more than he would in a negotiated framework in a multilateral sense.
If Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on Ukraine, do you expect big confrontation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Do you expect Trump to use all necessary means to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin?
Well, we have a pressure strategy. That is what is ongoing at the moment from Trump. What I don't see is any of this notion where people always go to this maximalist position that we're likely to have a World War III with the introduction of further weapons. I think one of the things that we've sort of seen with the demise of the Biden regime and the start of the Trump regime is actually, it seems that with the very clever attacks on the oil and gas infrastructure, that some of the sort of notions of escalation management, which Biden was always afraid of, seem to have been lifted. And for example, the attack this week on the Ryazan refinery prior to the war, that was 5% of refining capacity of Russia came from that Ryazan refinery. So the strategic targeting of the Ukrainians versus the sort of minor tactical gains, although they are tactical gains, of the Russians, seems to me to be the way to go at the moment, because the losses from a Russian perspective make no operational or strategic sense at the moment, but only an absolute autocracy could sustain that. And that is something that they may be able to sustain unless Putin and Russia goes to the notion of strategic culmination. And they might. Sometime during this year, it might be that the economy implodes, or the banking system under what has been mooted as the Cyprus scenario. That is that, you capitalize everyone's savings into shares, and people generally will lose 85% of their savings to keep the Russian economy afloat. And the third part of that is that the refurbishment rates of the from the Russian inventory seems to have peaked. So this is a period of a problematic period potentially for Russia. But as I said, authoritarian regimes keep going. And one of the lessons I think I learned from Prigozhin when he was knocking around Bakhmut was that he said that we might need to live like North Korea for a few years. And there's always the notion that potentially the Russian people could endure more pain to ensure that Putin remains in power and tries to achieve his objectives, his operational and strategic objectives in Ukraine, which he hasn't at the moment.
Do you think that Trump's administration is green-lighting Ukrainian strikes inside Russia right now?
Well, they've not put a red card on them, so that's the most important thing. And I think certainly from the perspective of General Kellogg, the special envoy, and as an ex-military three-star, he has a pragmatic realism in terms of the approach to how you might win a war. Now, obviously, fighting generally stops for 1, 2, or 3 reasons, either because of decisive military victory, that doesn't look on the cards at the moment, or because of the improbability of military victory. That seems more on the cards, but Putin still believes that strategic patience is on his side. Or thirdly, because of unacceptable costs, either economically, politically, militarily, or within the population. That is what Ukraine seeks to do at the moment, and actually what Putin sought to do in terms of, again, going for the infrastructure, energy infrastructure of Ukraine. We also need to understand why fighting doesn't stop. And one of the reasons fighting doesn't stop is because of the need for sufficient victory to justify the cost or sacrifice already incurred. So Putin will fight on in a forever war at the moment until he, one of those bits of the Clausewitzian trinity of the army walk off the battlefield as they did in 1917, or the population get fed up, or because there is elite defection. One of those three will probably pertain in the future. I'm not sure that will be 2025. I hope it is, but it's more likely that Putin is on the strategic defensive rather than Ukraine. And although there are some minor, as I said, tactical gains for Putin, as long as there is steadfast support from both Europe and America, and even if America were to withdraw that, I think the Europeans should stand up to the pitch. Then this thing has a hope, because it is Trump's number one foreign policy priority, to come to some sort of denouement, if not in 25, then sometime down the line. And the reason I'm saying not 25, but somewhere down the line, is negotiations can be very complex. And for example, it took 500 meetings and 2 years to get to the armistice in the Korean War in 1953.
Do you feel that Donald Trump has enough leverage over Vladimir Putin to force him to make serious concessions to Ukraine during the negotiations?
Well, the notion of negotiations anyway is, you have to, I think, put a slight caveat on that as well. That is a Western desire. It is not necessarily at the moment a Putin desire. So I think there'll still need to be more damage to Russia, significant damage at the strategic level to the oil and gas refineries, before you get him to a position where he would even contemplate negotiations. And for example, I think it was Lavrov who said that a ceasefire is a road to nowhere. So, they want to go somewhere, and that somewhere is still to achieve their political objectives, which are to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. That includes Ukraine, and to roll back to the pre-1997 borders in terms of NATO expansion.